money talks, there are so many different ways to get to know somebody. And the more you spend time with somebody, the more you learn about their personality, the more you learn about their likes and dislikes. You learn about their hobbies. You learn about their background and their history and their ethnicity and so on. But somebody once told me that the really, one of the ways you really get to know somebody is how they expend and deploy and invest their resources. It points to what really matters to them. In fact, if a great exercise for all of us, and something I try to do at the end of each month, is evaluate where all my resources went, because that is an indication of what's in my heart. It was Jesus who said, wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so it's a great barometer reading as to where and what really matters to me when I review my financial reports or bills or invoices at the end of the month, because it's an indication of what really matters to me. One of the things that I'm sure you have said, I know I have said on several occasions, is, I need this. I need it. You ever say that? I know that around our house, those words are said not only at times by me, but by my kids. Dad, we need this. There's no other way to do life without this. And so we tend to then go through an evaluation process as to, is it really a need or is it a want? It's two totally different things, isn't it? In fact, in our world, we see in many ways the two extremes of what we really need. I'm going to put an image on the screen as an illustration of this. You see, there are at least 700 million people who do not have access to clean water in our world. Every year, 500,000 children die from waterborne diseases. Friends, that's reality. For many in our world, that is their reality. I think that is a need, would you agree? Just clean water. On the other side of the spectrum, we hear of people like director Steven Spielberg, who last year decided he was going to sell his yacht worth $184 million. Why? Why was he selling his yacht? You know why? Because he needed a bigger one. He needed a yacht that was 18 feet longer, worth $250 million. I don't think that's a need. I think that's a want. Earlier this year, I noticed a national media report on a high-profile divorce, and I won't even mention who they are, but the court asked the spouse seeking child support to itemize the monthly needs that they felt they needed in order to make ends meet. And the monthly needs topped at $1 million. And it included $6,800 a month for groceries, $2,000 for stationery, $160,000 for vacation accommodations, and of course, $300,000 for a private jet, all on a monthly budget. We're going to need all this because we can't do life without it. I'm sure we all agree that desiring water, clean water, is a need and not a greed. I hope we all agree that $2,000 a month for stationery flips that equation upside down. But for most of us, what do we really need? When do our desire for an accumulation of more become this thing called greed? Do we need larger homes and nicer cars, a weekly manicure, and a new set of golf clubs every season? Do we really need that? And so these are questions we need to ask ourselves. It's interesting that most recently, a couple of pollsters went and asked a few questions to people. And one of the questions was, what do you see as the most prominent problem in North American culture? What do you see that's causing all sorts of difficulty in our culture? Do you know what the number one answer was? Greed and materialism. So So we responded to the pollsters by saying the greatest problem that our culture deals with is greed and materialism. This hunger, this craving for more. The same pollsters then did a poll that asked the question, what do you think is your greatest problem? What is your greatest struggle in your personal life? And they listed the 7 deadly sins. Do you know what came last? Greed. You see, this is teaching us something that, albeit we have no problem diagnosing the cultural problem of materialism and greed, but we have a difficulty diagnosing it in our own hearts. There's some sort of disconnect that we say the problem is out there, it's never in here. That's why Timothy Keller, well-known author and pastor, says this: even though it is clear that the world is filled with greed and materialism, almost no one thinks it is true of them. Greed hides itself from the victim. That's what's so dangerous about this thing called greed. That's why Jesus speaks about money as often as he does. And friends, we cannot be afraid to talk about money in church. Jesus taught about it. Greed is one of those things that lurks beneath all of our hearts, including mine. And it is a disease that can kill us. And so hence, a good shepherd will preach and teach on this really important topic. We all have a tendency to diagnose the problem out there, but have a tendency to not diagnose it in here. And so we go to the text, Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 21. Jesus is teaching, Luke chapter 12, 13 to 21. But before I go right into the specific text of the parable that Jesus speaks of, one of the great skills that we all need to learn when interpreting Scripture, here's some advice. Read what comes before your text and read what comes after the text, because that'll give you something called the context. It'll give you more understanding as to what that portion really means. And so I want to do that. I want to actually display that skill to you that you can do every day as you do your devotion. Read what comes before it, read what comes after it, and it'll give you a real great idea as to what the middle portion really means. And so I want to do that. So Luke chapter 12, the first 12 verses, before we get to our text, what is Jesus saying? He says a lot of things. Verse 1 of chapter 12, he says, meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered, so that they were trampling on one another. So this is a huge day in the ministry of Jesus. This is an opportunity for him to speak about something really important. And so when I read that there are crowds of people, so many crowds that they're trampling over each other, I'm thinking, okay, Jesus, what topic are you going to choose to speak about? And obviously, whatever topic he speaks about, he probably feels this is really important. This is my opportunity. Seeing that there's so many people, I want them to hear this. And it's interesting that amidst all the multitudes of people, Jesus chooses to teach on money this day. It's that important to Jesus, and so it should for us. He goes on, and before he begins to speak to the multitude, he kind of directs his words to his disciples. So he's talking to those that are already followers of God. And he begins to talk to them first about their resources, about their income, about their money. And he says, be on your guard. And what does he say? Be on your guard against hypocrisy. Don't be like the Pharisees. What does hypocrisy mean? The word actually means to act. You're making an act. You're acting a part. The Pharisees dressed a certain way. They talked a certain way. But inside, there was all kinds of corruption. God says, don't be that way. Be the real deal. You know why hypocrisy doesn't work in the kingdom? Because he goes on to say in verse 2, there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed or hidden that will not be made known. You know, sometimes when we think of our resources, obviously, and so this should be, it's something that's private. It's something that should be kept private. It's something that I am held accountable, that my family will be held accountable. And we don't know each other's resources and income and what's going on in our financial situation. But get this, God does. He knows every dollar that comes into my household. He knows all that God allows there to be in my house. He knows every dollar. I can't conceal it from him. And so how I manage those resources is something that I can't hide from him. He knows. He knows whether I am actually being generous or I'm not. We can fool each other, but we can't fool God. And so he begins this teaching by saying, don't be a hypocrite. Don't be like the Pharisees. At the end of the day, nothing is concealed before the Lord. He knows it all. He knows it all. He goes on to say, we need to have a healthy fear of God. In verse 5, fear him who after your body has been killed has authority to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Rather than fearing others or situations, have a healthy fear of God. The fear of God is this sense where, God, when I read your word, I want to make sure that my life is aligned to your way, because I know that your way is the best way. And so I want a healthy fear in my life over you. I want to make sure that all those areas of my life, because nothing is concealed from you, is aligned to your way, that when you look at my life, including how I manage my resources, you're nodding your head and you're saying, well done, well done. Here's more for you to be faithful for. Well done as you manage my resources, well done. Or do we hear him say, oh, are you kidding me? Don't you realize that everything that you have comes from me? Nothing is concealed, and having a healthy fear of the Lord is important. After our text between verses 13 and 21, Jesus then begins to speak about, starting in verse 22, not to worry. It's interesting. He says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. You see, sometimes we're so inflicted with fear about Pastor, how am I going to live a generous life? I don't even know if I'm going to make my bills at the end of the month. And God says, wait a minute. If I take care of the birds of the air, won't you trust me that I'll take care of you? Won't you trust me with your first fruits before anything else? You trust me and you invest in my kingdom, and I'll take care of the rest. Later on in that same, in verse 32, he says, do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to the poor, provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Wow, so we've got the context here. Before our text, after the text. Now let's go right into the text. Are you ready? Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. The word of the Lord says this. Someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Jesus replied, Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? And then he said to them, Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And he told them this parable. He said this, the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And then he said, This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus again, surplus of grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. So this is what you're to do. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, You fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Whew. May the Lord strengthen us today. May the word of the Lord speak life and protection over us today. Friend, as I read this text and I've been meditating on it and talking about it with my own family in preparation for our duration of life, I realize here that Jesus is telling us life is not defined by what you have. Life is not defined by what you have or don't have, for that matter. Life is not defined by what you have. Notice the question that comes from the crowd. There could have been, or the comment that comes from the crowd. That man could have said so many things. Jesus was there that day. Crowds of people. What an opportunity. And his comment and his question was, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. He could have asked so many things. But he talked to him about money. I want more money, Jesus. I'm craving more of it. Can you get involved in this situation so that I can get what I want? The reply from Jesus is simple. Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? In many ways, Jesus was not going to play the greed game with this individual. He was not going to allow this individual to use him for his own personal gains. Isn't it interesting that for all the questions that could have been asked of Jesus, the question pointed to something of selfish gain? Rather than asking Jesus what they could do for him, Jesus, you're here. What can we do for your kingdom? Where can we go? Just as our young adults stood here, they're indicating to us, God, my life is in your hands. Yes, I can use those resources selfishly. I can buy an iPad. But God, I'm going to invest in going to a foreign country so I can share the gospel. That's what spiritual vitality looks like. But this man, rather than saying, God, what can I do for you? He says, Jesus, I need you to do something for me. I need my inheritance. I need more dollars in my bank account. Can you use your power to sway my brother into doing this? I wonder what kind of questions or what fills most of our prayer times with the Lord. I wonder, do our questions point to making ourselves available to the Lord? Or do our prayer times center around selfish motives? Jesus, I want this. Jesus, I need this. Jesus, this. We never adore him, never worship him, never ask him, God, what? My life, it's yours. What can I do? How can I grow in my generosity? What else can I do in terms of my talent and my time for your glory? This is why Jesus continues in his response by stating the following: watch out. Be on your guard. Be alert. Remember, he's talking to the disciples here. He says, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possession. Catch that. As Christ followers, as pastors, we'd be naive to think that we are exempt from allowing this disease called greed to get into our hearts. Friends, the reason why we teach this, the reason why Jesus was teaching this, is not because he needs our money. It's so that we protect our hearts. It's so that we don't get this malady of craving more. We are all susceptible to this. And so he says, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Jesus is clearly saying life is not defined by what you have. life is not defined by what you have. What does that mean? That means if you have a little, it does not define you. Friend, listen. If you have a little, it does not define you. And maybe you're sitting here and you have gotten caught up with comparing yourself related to what you drive or don't drive. You're comparing your housing situation or your retirement savings plan or your clothes or whatever. Listen, you are more than all of that. You are a child of God. You are the apple of God's life, of God's eye. You mean the world to Him. He doesn't care how much you have or don't have. You are the most valuable possession in His heart and mind. So it doesn't matter how little you have. It doesn't define you. The same goes with if you have a lot. It does not define you. Because you have a lot, it's not guaranteed that you are successful in the eyes of God. At the same time, those who God have been blessed with affluence in their life, I want you to know something. And, quite frankly, that pretty much means all of us compared to the world's condition. We're some of the most wealthiest people in the world, right? But affluence, some of us have been blessed with affluence. And you know what? Affluence is not all that it looks. There's a burden that comes with affluence. There is more to be responsible for in the eyes of God. And sometimes those who are affluent have a difficult time of discovering who their real friends are. Because people will latch onto them just because of who they are or what they have. And that leaves that person wondering, who really cares for me? Friend, I want you to know, if you are affluent, I want you to know that God loves you for who you are, not by what you can do. And though you get that pressure from those around you, I want you to know that God sees value in you, not because of the dollar figures beside your name or your bank account, but because you're one of His kids. If you have a lot, it does not define you. Life does not consist in abundance of possessions, Jesus says. And so He says, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Watch out for the voice of craving. Friends, our marketers this day are amazing at wanting us to think that we need all sorts of things, right? Every time I get something in the mail or turn on the TV, it's amazing. They tell me I am the center of the universe and that I need their product in order to make life real good. And we need to intentionally push the voice of craving, the desire for more, away. There are times where we have this ache for more, a desire for more. We'll say things like, oh man, I'd die for that. Hunger for more. There's this itch sometimes that comes in our life for more. We long for more. We salivate for more. We thirst for more. We wish for more. We yearn for more. More, more, more. And that voice of craving is loud in our culture. But when greed wants to rise up, that voice of craving wants to rise up in your life, respond by abhorring it, by despising it, by detesting it, hate it, reject it out of your life. Jesus says, watch out for it. See, one thing that Sylvia and I have learned along the way, and we're still learning, is the best way to protect oneself from greed is to give your money and possessions away. That's one guaranteed way to ensure that greed doesn't get into my heart, by giving it away. And so we have an intentional plan in our life. Have an intentional plan of ensuring you live a life of generosity. And the word intentional is really important. And so I'll share with you our process. We have an intentional plan. We know when income comes in, and I'm at this point in our lives the only one who has an income in our household. And so we know when that income comes into the account. And so we already know the moment that comes in, that there is a percentage that goes straight to Heartland of Church Connected. because this is our storehouse. This is where we belong. This is where I'm loved. This is where I get to serve. This is where my kids are nurtured and raised in the ways of the Lord. This is my home. And so right off the bat, a percentage. And I remember way back years ago when that percentage, when we started together in our family, that percentage was 10%. That was a great starting point for us. But as God has continued to reveal His faithfulness in our lives, that percentage has grown. Why? Because the more God blesses, the more I get to be generous with. And over and above that, with offerings and so on. And so there's an intentional plan. If you don't have an intentional plan, you are more vulnerable and susceptible to allowing greed, this disease that sometimes lurks below the waterline in our lives. If you don't put an intentional giving plan into your life, you are in danger of becoming like the fool in the story that Jesus tells. You see, I want you to think, when He built His original barns, I think he built a bigger barn than 100 square feet. I think it was bigger than a 10 by 10 building. I think he built a barn and he thought to himself, man, if I could ever fill these barns, man, I'd be a happy guy. Would you agree? I'd have everything I need to do life. But then God, because of His faithfulness, fills those barns. And you'd think in that moment He'd be like, wow, God, you have filled my barn that I constructed many years ago. And now, God, with the overflow, everything else that has come in, guess what? I'm going to give it into your kingdom and be rich in God and invest in the kingdom because, God, you built my barn. You filled my barn. But He doesn't. What does He do? He says, wow, more has come in. That means I can increase my lifestyle. And rather than investing the overflow of God's blessing in his life, he just built himself bigger barns. He built himself a more lavished lifestyle. Ultimately, when he filled it, he was not satisfied to begin with. He wanted more. So he built himself a bigger barn. And so Jesus responds to this gentleman in the story this way: "You fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." Friend, our lives are in the hands of the Lord. And sometimes in our culture, we are ingrained that we are man-made. We build our own empires, but in a moment, life can change, can't it? And this man had thought, man, I've got a great plan, and I'm going to eat, be merry for the rest of my life. I'm going to party, I'm going to relax. And God comes knocking and saying, actually, tonight's your last night. Tonight's your last night. See, Jesus is saying that's what happens when you fill your barn, when you fill your life with self and not with God. When we fill our lives with self and not with God, the story doesn't end well. As I was thinking through this message and thinking through my own life and challenges and how I've struggled at times with this thing and wanting to suppress this disease and eradicate it from my life, here are some potential reasons why we don't live generously at times. Here are some of the roadblocks that at times get in the way of us living that life of generosity. And rather than living by giving more of the overflow to the Lord, we live for ourselves. This might be some of the reasons. Number one, self at times is supreme. Sometimes it's all about us and our convenience and what I can get and what I can accumulate, rather than what difference can I make in somebody else's life. That's why Jesus said, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I believe that sometimes that overflow, that blessing of the Lord, that's a test. What are you going to do with that? So, for example, this past week, my sons got something in the mail from Grandpa and Grandma. Oh, those are nice cards, aren't they? And in there's a nice little gift for them. And so we read them the card, and their eyes went when they saw the money in there. So we had a little discussion. What are you going to do with God's overflow blessing in your life? One of my dear sons, well, he had a whole list of things. And I said, oh, okay. I said, well, here's some thoughts to consider. And the one son didn't like my thoughts. And so I said, you know what? Take some time to think about it. Think about it. We'll talk about it at night. So, because I want them to learn this. Want them to understand it early. You know why? Because that disease, it comes early. Later on in the evening, he kind of makes his way. And in passing, he says, oh, by the way, I'm going to take your advice. And we'll do this. I won't give the details. But it's a good thing. I think it'll please God what they've planned to do with it. But we have to be that intentional because self is supreme. Our initial response will be, what more can I do now for myself? Rather than, God, what more can I do for you? Number 2, many believe God's way is optional. You know, if there is a topic that I have had more theological conversations over, money and tithing and you name it, whatever you want to call it, that's at the top of the list. It is amazing how we do all sorts of theological gymnastics over this thing. I don't believe in tithe. It's an Old Testament principle. Okay, fine. Let's do a New Testament principle. Jesus says, sell all your possessions, give it to the poor. You like 100% over 10? That's great. Let's go with that. The point is generosity. And are you truly living? Because everything is seen by the Lord. He knows. You can't hide it from Him. He knows. But sometimes we hear the word and we just say, you know what, I just don't like it. I don't like that part. And so we ignore it. And we look at the word of God as optional. Friends, Psalm 33:4 says, for the word of the Lord is right and true. He is faithful in all that He does. Psalm 119, 105, your word, it's a lamp for my feet, a light on my path. When we hear these biblical teachings, may we not disregard it, but we say, God, you're protecting me. Remember, it's not because He needs my money and yours, it's because He's protecting us. Galatians 6:7, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. If you sow sparingly in the kingdom, guess what? You're going to reap sparingly. If you have an intentional plan, it's precise, there's lots of conversations and prayers, God will honor that. Third obstacle to living a life of generosity might be fear of tomorrow, which is why at the back end of this passage he talks about worry and not worrying about tomorrow. Jesus said, do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. The kingdom. And sometimes we worry. We say, Pastor, it's a great thought to live generously and to give this amount to the work of the Lord, whether it's 10% or beyond. And, but I got to pay my rent, and I can't afford that. Friend, you can't afford not to give. You watch. God is saying, trust me with your first fruit. Bring it to me, and all these things will be added unto you. I'll take care of you. But until you don't trigger that first fruit, how do you expect me to make sure that 90% or 80% or 70%, that goes longer than you expected? That work environment will change, and I'll create more income for you, and certain other things will go well in your way, and your car won't break down every month anymore. And there's a variety of things that God can do. But you've got to start that. You've got to put your life under the windows of heaven with obedience. Last night was such a great night here. And even this morning, an individual who came to worship last night is back this morning, and he said, Pastor, I'm taking you up on the challenge. As I said, Malachi 3 says, God says, test me in this. Trust me with your tithe and see what I'll do. And so he came to me this morning and says, Pastor, I just want you to know, I'm doing this. And I know I'm in a tight spot, but I'm going to trust God with the rest. Friend, I dare you. In fact, God does. He says, test me in this and see what I'll do. There's this fear of tomorrow sometimes that grips our heart, which causes us not to live a generous life. Number 4, a focus on others rather than self. Sometimes we have come up with reasons why we don't live generously because of what other people have done. Hear me on this. Sometimes, if you have lived a generous life and you've invested in all sorts of things, you will recognize that not all your investments turned out the way you wanted them to turn. That happens in life. Organizations, individuals, they make mistakes, and you invested in that kingdom initiative and it didn't work out or didn't get fulfilled or whatever it was. And because of that, there's a moment where you think, you know what, I am not going to give anymore because of that. I'm not going to do that anymore. Don't allow what other people have done and their mistakes to hinder you from being a generous follower of Christ. Don't do it. Don't allow that to happen. Don't allow yourself to have a 2x4 through your eye and you're trying to take a speck and you're focusing on what others have done. Just live generously. Be smart, be educated, be a good manager. Don't just throw it out there, but at the end of the day, don't withhold it because of what other people have done. Jesus said, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? Be good managers of God's resources, but don't allow someone else's mistakes to be your excuse for not being generous. And finally, maybe one of the potential reasons why we don't live generously is we're waiting for the right season. We're waiting for the right season. We look at our kids and say, they're too young to start giving. Friend, the moment they start telling you, Dad, Mom, I need this. I want that. We need to upgrade that, Dad. You know the disease is ready to latch onto them. If that happens, they're ready to learn what it looks like to live and give generously. Then the kids grow up and they become teens and they get part-time jobs and they think, I've got to save up for my education, so I can't give right now because I got to save up every time. No. Then we get into university and we get our first job. And, oh, man, finally, we get into university and we say, once I get my job into my career, then I'll start giving to the work of the Lord. Then you get your first job. And guess what? With your first job comes your car and your insurance and maybe your apartment rent. And all of a sudden, I can't. I'm going to wait till I get married. When you get married, there are other challenges. Now, all of a sudden, you have other expenses. You buy your first house, and you have a mortgage, and you have your car, and we can't. Then you start having kids, and you're like, oh, I got to put our ESPs away. I can't give. And then you get to retirement, and you say, I've got a fixed income. You've lived your whole life without giving a life of generosity. Friend, if you wait for the right season, it'll never come. Today is the right season. Now is the right season to live a life of generosity. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. I conclude with this as Pastor Chris and the team comes. I want you to think of an animal you'd really be afraid of. Maybe an angry rhinoceros that looks a little like this. And you're standing there, and this beast of an animal is headed your way. If you came around a corner and found yourself facing it, what would you want to do? Exactly. Run like you've never run before. You run away. Well, friends, as a follower of Christ, that's how you should feel about a lifestyle of greed. When greed and the voice of craving starts creeping into your life, friend, don't hang around. Watch out for it. Turn and sprint the other way. Run as fast as you can, because it is a disease that will destroy you. It'll wrap you up and entangle you, and it'll trample all over you. It'll control you. It'll manipulate you. It'll cause all kinds of heartache in your life. Then think how you'd feel if you saw the person you loved best in the entire world, who you hadn't seen for years, walking down the street, what would you do then? You'd probably chase after them. You'd embrace them. That's how you should behave when you think of Jesus and the new life that he is offering you and the whole world. And so when Jesus shares his principles, the crowds are there. They're trampling over each other. And what does he talk about? He talks about money. And rather than detesting it, rather than pushing it away, rather than saying, what is this guy, what is this Messiah talking about? Run to him. Do it his way. Embrace it. Because he loves you, he wants to protect you from a disease that is so prevalent in our culture, friend. And it's not just out there that's the problem. It might be lurking in here. Might be lurking in here. Maybe today you need to start putting a line in the sand. You need to do things a little different in your home. God says, test me in it. And watch how I'll open the floodgates of heaven over your life. And I'll do things you never would have imagined.